Welcome back. We are we've been talking about this particular series in our live streams on Sundays, and I thought for this particular format, we would just maybe do an overview of the weeks that we spent doing that. It's not going to be as specific or detailed of information, but more of an overview just to give the idea of what we're talking about. And we're actually talking about money. The series was called Money Matters. And I think it's important for us to talk about money because Jesus talked about it.
Talked about it. One of the biggest subjects he talked about. So we're breaking our talk up into three parts today: perception, priorities, and a plan. So I'm just going to read a couple of verses because I'm basing this whole series was off of part of Jesus' talk in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, where he said, "Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. So seek first the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need." So we're going to take some of those ideas that Jesus talked about here and develop them a bit. So the first thing I want to talk about here is how we may need to change our perceptions about money if we want to follow Jesus and obey his teachings. Right.
So the first perception that I want us to get our mind around is that we are rich. Compared to lots of other people in the world, we have it pretty well off. So I know most of us don't feel rich. In fact, I would say most people, including those who are probably richer than we are, I feel like there's not enough to go around at the end of the month.
Yeah, there's definitely the scarcity mentality that is very present.
Yeah, and I think our culture kind of runs on that.
Yeah,
advertising is constantly bombarding us with you need something more or something else.
Scarcity or FOMO.
Yeah. Fear of missing out.
You fear missing this out.
Yeah. I think that's a kind of scarcity mentality.
It is, absolutely.
So just as an example, what we would consider the lowest wage in Canada, that's around the poverty line, which is about $25,000 of family income in a year, is still greater than 80% of the rest of the world. I mean, that averages in all the billionaires too. So that's interesting. And if you take the average wage or family income in Alberta, it's in the top 5% of wage earners worldwide. So I think the point of changing our perception to what the Bible would call an abundance mentality, or just the idea that we do have more than other people, and that actually comes with responsibilities. 1 Timothy, Paul wrote a letter to Timothy, and it's found in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And Paul says to Timothy, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in the wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share." So, from there, we look at perception number 2 is that if left to our own devices and we don't think about it, even if it's unintentional, we tend to be greedy.
Yeah, and I think that's is interesting because the idea is that first thing, very few people would ever admit that they are greedy. But I wonder if sometimes the reason why we do that is because we see you're either greedy or you're not.
Yeah.
As opposed to seeing it maybe more of a spectrum.
Yeah, and we might think of the old billionaires are greedy, or
that's just it.
Scrooge
it's the worst scenario, and at least I'm not that, so I can't be greedy. It's like, no, we can still be greedy and not be that.
Because the actual definition of greed is a selfish or excessive desire for more of something, such as money, than is needed. So from that perspective, we can see that if we aren't intentional about not being greedy, we're going to want to have more for ourselves.
Yeah.
Just as an example, have you ever bought something you were convinced you needed, and you used it maybe once or twice, and now it's in your basement or garage and not being used?
Not at all. Don't look in my basement or garage.
Yeah, just don't look at my basement or garage. Yeah. And I think what we have to counteract this idea with is we can't assume that everything that comes to us or that we get, whether it be money or resources in any form, is just for us to consume. Yeah. Perception number 3, God is our provider. We believe that God created the earth with abundance and he wants to give us more than we need. But do we really trust him to provide for us, or do we take matters into our own hands? And I think that's, again, the natural thing is from original sin is we want to be in control. Right. We don't trust God to do what's right. We want to choose what's right for ourselves. And when it comes to money, we're going to try and control the outcome so we get as much as we can.
Right.
So there comes to perception number 4 is, which leads right up to that one, is that it's not our money, it's actually God's money. So when it comes to managing it, we are God's money managers. So we need to learn how to manage God's money wisely.
And I think this is a good way to sort of reframe things for us, because we tend to be a little bit like I think the average person, if we frame it as our money, we're a little more like tend to be like, I'll do what I want.
Yeah.
If we frame it as just someone else's,
yeah,
we usually are a little bit less just sort of free with that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And changing that mindset might also change, like, okay, if I'm thinking that this is not money, it's somebody else's money, it really does change on how we may spend it.
Exactly. That's the whole point of looking at it that way, is that we are God's money managers. And again, the reason for that, I think Jesus said it very clearly, is that our chief competitor to serving God is the love of money.
Yeah, well, especially as we come off of recently doing the Minor Prophets, and you realize that very thing is the issue that some of the minor prophets had with the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
Is because they were experiencing wealth, but a lot of that wealth wasn't really coming out of good practices. It was off the exploitation of the vulnerable and the poor of their own people.
And
so therefore they weren't loving God, because God, I believe it's Amos, was like, I don't like all your celebrations.
Yeah.
I hate it. And it had everything to do with, because of how you are treating these people, you've chosen to build your wealth, therefore serve money as opposed to me. Because if you're serving me, it would be with it rivers of justice and whatnot, and righteousness flowing through.
And then
not this.
The fact that they were still worshiping, or at least pretending to worship God, God sees right through that.
Right through it.
All right, so taking those changes in mind, that we've talked about, those 5 perceptions, I want to switch to what priorities we need to change in our lives. So money managers will tell you to prioritize your goals and then pay to them first, which means if you decide you're going to save money, every time you get paid, take part of the money before you have a chance to spend it, and put it towards savings, because our tendency is to spend everything we get.
Yep.
So that's
easy
just
to do it.
Human nature. So we want to talk about some different priorities here. The first priority, I think, if we're going to show that we're not enslaved to money, is to give to God and others first. So again, this comes down to that idea that we're God's money managers, and that God has purposes and mission that he wants to accomplish in the world. And in our world, it takes money to do that. So, but again, I think as pastors, sometimes we've given people that God is after your money.
Yeah.
And really, if it belongs to him, it doesn't make sense that he's after it. It's his to start with. What is God after then? He's really after our hearts.
Yeah.
So we need to manage our money wisely to show that our heart is in the right place. Mm-hmm. The other thing, too, that I think some people might ask, well, how do I actually give to God? Well, a couple of areas here that I want to talk about. One is God's mission. In Matthew 28, just before Jesus goes back to heaven, he tells the disciples, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And so typically that happens through the local church community. And that could be another whole series, but I think the idea from your money's perspective is if you attend a local church, then you should support them financially. Also, Jesus is very concerned with the poor and marginalized and the oppressed. And that was what you brought up before when the rich were in Israel, in the minor prophets were taking advantage of those who were poor or marginalized and actually oppressing them. That did not please God at all. There's lots of ways for us to do that. Typically, we give to organizations that do those things. So we can give our money. I know our church last week we got together and bought some things and packed lunches and dropped them off at for the drop-in center. So there's different ways that we can do that with our money and our time. And one of the things I talked about in the messages was hospitality. And that's using the resources of our homes and tables to befriend our neighbors and then pray for opportunities to point people to Jesus. I think our second priority is to save. I think God wants us to be responsible with his money, but that doesn't mean we have to live lives that are completely minimalist and not care about our families. Those things are important to God. So, one, I'm going to suggest 3 different categories of saving. One is to set aside money for emergencies. And the reason for that is you don't have to go into debt for things that you need that come up unexpected, because there are legitimate things. Like sometimes your car will break down, and the repair cost is $2,000 or $3,000, and very few of us have that kind of money just lying around. So we'll typically put it on a credit card, or at least that's what I've done in the past. So I think if I had an emergency fund, then I wouldn't have had to go into debt, and that kind of makes sense for me once I became aware of this. The second one mentioned in credit cards is to actually pay off debt. As we talked about in the morning messages, debt actually makes us a slave to money. The interest and payments that we have to pay every month on those debts, they prevent us from being generous and being able to give to people, to be able to give to God, and even enjoying the things we have because they're not really paid for.
Right.
The last thing I think that it's important is to save for retirement. We don't want to be a financial burden to our loved ones once we can no longer work or earn money. So when it comes to saving for retirement, it's critical to start early and to be consistent. In that case, I will get into that on the plan side. Compound interest is your friend in that case.
Right.
The last priority, and probably one of the most important ones, is that we get to live on the rest. And by the rest, I mean what's left over after you've given to God and others and you've put aside money to save. Now, the trick here, or the strategy here, is we may have to adjust our lifestyle a little bit, not to go into debt. And so when something does come up that's an actual emergency that we do have to buy, then we have our emergency fund if something comes up unexpectedly. So again, the priorities here are to give to God first, save some money second, and then the third is to live on the rest. Then we'll get to our last P, which is plan. And we're going to talk about some specifics here about how much and how we accomplish it.
Right.
So now that we've changed our perceptions and established our priorities, now we have a plan to do that. So I'm going to do them in reverse order.
Okay.
So we're going to start with live on the rest. So this is after we've given to God and set aside our money for savings. I'm going to just give an example here. To plan to live on 80% of your income after taxes. So this is typically the amount of money you get on your paycheck.
Right.
And so we're going to save 20% for saving and giving, and we're going to try and live on the rest. And in order to do that, we have to do the thing that most of us hate to do, and that's to make a budget. And in order to make a budget, sometimes it's helpful to kind of just take a month and just spy on your money.
Yeah, see how much is going into what. And I know I've done that before, and kind of been horrified sometimes when I realized, I'm putting that much money into this. I never would have thought that.
I spend this much money. How much money on Starbucks coffees every month, or whatever? I mean, for some people, it's comic books or records or anything, tools. We all have our certain thing that we tend to overspend in. So I think those are the things we need to look at and say, okay, one, we've already talked about we have to adjust and cut some things back. Yeah. But two, sometimes we can still set aside some money in our budget to do those things. Because we do, again, in the verse I read, it says that God wants us to enjoy what we have. Yeah. And so maybe just set aside some money, and once we've spent that much on whatever we like to spend it on, don't spend any more until the next month.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope that makes sense for everybody. It's not totally rocket science. And again, we get into some more specifics if you want to go back and look at some of those other podcasts or they were live stream messages. The next one is to save. So again, when it comes to emergency fund, I know if you're already in debt, it's hard to save money. So I would say look at the Starbucks coffee, for example.
Yeah.
If you can save $50 or $100 a month there, maybe buy coffees on work days only and not on weekends, kind of thing. You can usually save up $1,000 in less than a year. And then once you have saved up that, then you're going to shift that money that you've been using to fund your emergency fund. You're going to switch to paying off debt. And then once your debt is paid off, you're going to switch back to the emergency fund, and then you're going to try and build up 3 to 6 months of your family income, depending on your level of security.
Right.
All right. So the next thing we want to do is to get out of debt. Now, I'm going to briefly explain something called the debt repayment snowball, the debt repayment snowball plan. Basically, the idea is if you have 4 credit cards or lines of credit or debts, not necessarily your car payment or your mortgage, those are usually more long-term. But if you have, one time I think I had 6 or 7, and I use this way. So basically you cut up all your credit cards and maybe keep one so you have a credit rating, but don't use it. And then pay the minimum payments on all the cards except for the one with the least, either the lowest interest or the least amount, just so you can pay it off quickly. You get feels like you're getting some momentum.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you pay double on that one.
Okay.
And then it might take a year, might take 18 months, depending on how much it is. But if it's the smallest one, it's going to be the least amount of time. Then the next, once that one's paid off, you take that payment, apply it to the next credit card that you've picked. And again, it has to be at least double. So sometimes the first one is a fairly low amount because your minimum payment is low.
Right.
But you might want to make the second one bigger. And then you can see as you move through the credit cards, your payment gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you're paying 3 or 4 or 5 times the amount of the minimum payment. And that last one actually gets, even though it might be the largest amount, usually it's paid off quicker than the one that was the smallest amount because you've gotten into the habit of using that money to pay off your debt.
Well, that makes, because you've created a habit and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, again, once your debt is paid off, then we got to go back and top up our emergency fund, but then we can start saving for retirement. Now, again, typically a money manager will say to save between 10 and 20% of your income. And I think that depends on when you're starting.
Yeah.
My advice would be to start when you're in your 20s, save that to 10%. It's usually not that much money at that age. And if you're consistent and keep doing it, it does compound. If you got started later, like I did, paying off my debt, then I got to put a lot more money in to do that. But again, I'm at a stage of life where I can actually do that. My kids are actually grown up and not living at home anymore, so it's less of a cost for me. And just as an example for compound interest, if you were to save $250 a month and you started at age 20 and you were going to retire at age 65 and you put $250 a month away, you would have put in $135,000 over that 45 years.
Okay.
But if you put it into say a mutual fund that earned 7%, you would at age 65 have almost $1 million, 900 and some $1,000. If you were a little more savvy with your investments and you had stocks or maybe something a little more stable like the S&P 500 fund that averaged a little closer to 12% over that same period, you would have over $4 million. So compound interest is really, it's not magic. It's just as you get interest on the money, you keep making payments, and then you start getting interest on your interest, and it builds up over 45 years. The last thing I want to talk about today, or we're going to talk about today, is giving to God and to others. And again, I think there is a biblical precedent for giving 10%. But one other idea before we get to that I want to talk about is spiritual maturity. There was a study done about 10 years ago. It was called the Reveal Study, done by a mega church in the States. And they had affiliates who did it, and then they kind of opened it up. The company who did the study opened it up to other churches. I think we might have even participated in the study. And when we get the results back from that, it showed that as people mature in their faith, they tend to give more to God and others. And I think that makes sense because we give according to what we value. And as Jesus said at the beginning in the verse, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And I think it's an indication of where our heart is.
So giving in generosity is an indication of maturity.
Spiritual maturity, yeah. And I thought that was an interesting thing. So again, I know if I ask you to give 10% today, anybody who's watching, some of you just aren't able to do that. Yeah. And so I think on the maturity scale, if you're just starting as a follower of Jesus, give something, $10 a paycheck, $50 a paycheck. Try working up to a percentage, even 1%. I think as you mature in your faith and as you get in the habit of giving, work up to a percentage, start with even 1 or 2%. Again, it's usually not that much money depending on your income. And then I truly believe God blesses us when we do that. And then we can work ourselves up to maybe every quarter or every year at another percentage until we're up to 10%. And I think for most people, that's a place where it's going to be maybe a bit of a stretch, but you're still being obedient. And I honestly believe that you can be a fully mature follower of Jesus. And we would call that being a disciple. I think in the message, I had a little graph that showed the different stages. And I believe that you can be a fully mature, not that we ever achieve perfection or full maturity, but I believe we get to a point where we definitely are mature in our faith, and we'd still be giving 10% or even less than that, depending on what we are able. And that reminded me of a parable in Matthew 25. It's called the parable of the talents. And when the landowner, which represents God, is giving out the money for his servants to manage, again, the metaphor fits right in with what we've been talking about. He gave different amounts to different people, and it said that it was according to their ability. And that got me thinking that some people maybe or likely have the ability to give more than 10%. And so I think there are people who are just gifted at money making. And again, the temptation would always be to be greedy or even just give 10%. And it's funny how as we make more money, statistically people give less to charity. Yeah. And so even if we were to give just the 10%, 80% of $1 million is still way more than 80% of, say, 100,000. So the idea that popped into my mind is how much is enough.
Right.
And so, again, we discussed this idea in a little more detail. But the other thing that struck me was that I had mentioned before was depending on your season of life, you may be able to give more.
Right.
I know that I am able to now, and I choose to do that because I believe it's the right thing to do, and I want to do that because I'm able to. And so that's kind of an overview of what we've talked about today.
Yeah, and so I know as you listen through this, and maybe you haven't been following along with our live stream, this can feel a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
And first thing, absolutely understandable, it's overwhelming. You might have lots of questions and about different things. This is really an overview. This is just to really challenge some thinking and to cause us to rethink and or get more information on. Because money is a very controversial kind of topic to hit. It's very sensitive for a lot of people.
Sure.
And we want some of that sensitivity to be touched so that we can kind of challenge ourselves. Maybe we can give more. Maybe we, whether that's give more in whatever, to charities, the church and all that, but also maybe we give more to our own retirement plan because we haven't been doing that. Or whatever it is. And there's a lot of or to our debt. Maybe we're better at making debt than we are at paying it off.
At paying it off, yeah.
And all of those things can be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's one step at a time. Take this and just sort of leave these challenging. Maybe there's a specific area I maybe need to focus in on this. This is a real big lack in the area. Just take it one step at a time. For more information about this, go look back at those live stream messages. We can link them in the description just to help you find those, and just to get a little bit more details as far as that is concerned. And then make sure maybe this is just challenge you need to seek the help of a financial advisor.
I forgot to mention that. That's a really good point. A financial planner did actually help me greatly.
Yeah, and don't feel you can't do that. There's some great help in there. Everyone's situation's a little bit different, but this is hopefully just help frame some things and will lead us into a better use of knowing how to use money and that not to be enslaved to it.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you will have a great week. We hope that you are challenged. And thank you, and join us again as we have more stuff coming out throughout the summer.